Good afternoon and welcome everybody to today's webinar. I hope you're all keeping well, given the current climate and temperatures across Europe. Just to introduce myself, I'm Kate Walsh, the Relationship Manager for the Certified Investment Fund Director Programme. So if you have any questions about the programme or interested in registering, please do get in touch with me directly and we'll talk you through that process. We're currently accepting applications for the next cohort CIFD programme, which is starting at the end of August, and the class week for that is in October. Today, we are joined by our CIFD Programme Director, Giles Swan, who will be talking to two of our CIFD alumni, so very CIFD heavy presence at our event today, John and Grainne, for the next 45 minutes or so. If you have any questions during the session, then please just submit them in the question box below. And I'm going to hand you over, Giles, now to get started. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, or actually good morning, I guess, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us. I'm delighted to have my welcome to today's session, where we're going to look at some of the evolving challenges in the ESG space and in the Luxembourg market as well. I kind of receive invites, I don't know about you, to sessions talking about ESG or what's happening in the markets almost on a daily basis. But today we're going to look at some of these issues through the lens of a fund director. And I'm delighted that we're joined by Grainne Dooley and John Griffin today. As Kate mentioned, Grainne and John, you're CIFD Alumni, so you've been through the Certified Investment Fund Director Programme experience, and you're still alive and kicking to tell the story at the end of that. So just by way of introduction, do you want to just give us a sentence or two, Grainne, maybe you first, on your background, what you do during your waking hours, and also why you did the programme, the CIFD programme, what you got out of it. Grainne, over to you.
Thanks, Giles, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm currently building out an INED portfolio, and I did the reason I did the CIFD program, I guess, is twofold. First of all, I wanted to help transition from an executive career in investment management into the non-executive element of the investment fund space. And then I also I want to get a more holistic overview of the organizational structure around fund governance. And I think, coming from an investment management background, the delegated model initially seemed somewhat confusing for me, especially as regards third-party management companies. And I think, potentially can be more challenging to, for effective fund governance. And I'd like to say that happily that the program did really fulfill those criteria for me. The classroom engagement was very good, classroom sessions, and then we had a learning journal that we needed to submit, which really kind of solidified everything that we've gone through. And I think also it's a really good networking. It's a great network, actually, and allows you to do continuous education, which I think is very important for an INED.
Thank you, Grainne. Delighted to have you with us today. John.
Thank you, Giles. Good afternoon, everybody. My journey was quite similar, I guess, to Grainne's in a way, that I was transitioning from an executive role that I retired from in 2020, having been the CEO of the largest asset manager in Luxembourg for many, many years. But I actually first met the senior management of, I guess, representing CIFD in 2019 when I was still executive. And I was very impressed with the format of the study and could see the need internally for executives, let alone non-execs. But my journey was to take the cohort 16 alongside Grainne virtually in 2020. I was initially a little bit skeptical that it was, too much tilted to Ireland as a domicile. And I was, very pleased to see that there was at least, 30% that were not coming from the Irish market. And indeed, some of the presenters were coming in from Luxembourg. So for me, I like the fact that it really dealt with investment funds and management companies very specifically, unlike a number of other courses that are much broader.
Thank you, John and Grainne, and I'll spare us all the blushes of counting up how many years of industry experience we've collectively got. So let's turn to the first topic, which is, I think, a real key area of focus for many people in the fund industry, but actually for directors I think particularly given the regulatory interest, and that's ESG. And just to kind of level set here and set some background on Grainne, I'm going to turn to you first. So, you know, we hear a lot about these sort of terms of greenwashing or green bleaching or other similar concepts, and I'm not even sure if I understand fully what all of these different things mean, but they generally sort of negative concepts when we're talking about how the industry is tackling ESG from a sort of regulatory perspective, or actually from the perspective of describing what we're doing for investors. So, Grainne, just first question to you. You know, are we, the industry, in sort of broadly the right place here? Are regulators in broadly the right place, or is this all sort of doom and gloom? And how are directors of funds rising to the ESG challenge?
Thanks, Giles. I mean, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. So that I certainly start in a positive way of thinking about it. And I think also I'm coming into this, you know, into the INET space when the ESG agenda is becoming mainstream. There's an acceptance that sustainable finance is the direction of travel, and there's a big commercial opportunity there for that as well. So from that point of view, I mean, we're seeing, you know, there's organization across the industry. There's going to be change, and I think you know, we recognize that there's many problems here. There's information asymmetry, there's data deficiency, there's lots of new information coming on board all of the time. But I do believe that, you know, if a board has an executive that is engaged in this process, and I mean, thus far, I mean, my experience to date is that there is, you know, there's an acceptance of all of the challenges, but the executives are engaged, and as a result, you know, the board can ask the relevant questions. Then I think that it's, you know, because from a company's point of view as well, I mean, there's both, you know, there's transition and there's transformational change going on with this, you know, with the commercial opportunity this is, you know, this is providing. So I think that once you have that, you have the support of the executive, and you're demonstrating both at an executive and a board level that you are engaged with this, then I think that, you know, I think then that we can definitely rise to that challenge.
Thank you, Joe. So actually positive, optimistic, dare I say, those comments. John, do you share that sentiment?
I do indeed, and I think, you know, you've got to be reminded that, you know, fund or management company directors have been on an ESG journey for some years now. You know, before the legislation and the regulation was in place, a lot of institutional investors in funds were pushing for, you know, sustainable outcomes, particularly if they were from the Nordics, Netherlands, or whatever else. So there was already a theme coming. What we have now is a lot more of the regulatory framework that is now addressing it. It can't be doom and gloom, right? I mean, this is all about getting to a better world, right? And the charge is being led by Europe, right? And if you look into the flows, which is the lifeblood of any fund business, the flows are in funds that have a sustainable statement. It is complex, it is imperfect, because what you have is a political intention that needs to marry with implementation. And it's not all synced up, time-wise, whatever else, right? But the tone, certainly from the regulator here in Luxembourg, is, you know, we are all learning by doing, right? And I think that's important, right? Because you can't wait to get absolute clarity to act, because you're bound to act in line with where regulation takes it. And I think for the directors, we have to recognize there are people working day in, day out in ever-growing teams in asset managers wrapped around this, right? It's not the expectation of the director to have that level of detail. However, it's incumbent on all directors to understand, you know, the path, the particular positioning of a firm, and the strategy of the firm. And when those product events are presented to you for approval, to make sure you do understand, right? And in that understanding, it's either by active questioning or taking information from associations like the CIFD or from a myriad of places, but you have to inform yourself right? As you said, Giles, every day there is an ESG flavored webinar or conference or whatever else. It's all out there. And I think it is incumbent on directors to learn so they can question. Right? At the end of the day, that's your role as supervision and oversight.
And Giles, just one thing I would just say on the, the greenwashing. I mean, to date, I feel that the stories around greenwashing have more exposed kind of the culture of these organizations. And we recognize that there are ongoing cultural issues within some of these financial organizations. And again, I think it behoves the director to try and, to ensure in some ways that their values are aligning with an organization's values. And there's probably many ways of going about that before you, think of joining a board.
And maybe if I can come in on the greenwashing, it's a risk to the asset manager where they're selecting, target investments that, if they were to give a misleading impression of their ESG credentials. But there's also where you are, putting products out there with certain objectives that if, the end-to-end basis of what is proposed in pre-contractual documents to what is in the prospectus to the investment process, if that doesn't align, then I think it's as important to consider that as a mis-selling risk.
And John, would you consider mis-selling to be different to greenwashing then? Because I hear the greenwashing term used in the context of ESG, and I've heard mis-selling used previously. Are they different?
Well, I'm no expert either. I'm just sort of reflecting on commentary from the regulator in Luxembourg, where they have been talking about it's not greenwashing, it's mis-selling. And I think that's the way in which, from a product governance perspective, they're making sure that those charged with governance think of it in that way. And it will be played out over time. But I think it makes people's ears prick up.
I think both of those certainly do. Grainne, you mentioned a few of the issues I think we're going to get into now, which is some of the challenges, particularly around information and data, and they're I think, versed. Maybe the solutions to solve those problems aren't so much so. The transition and the sort of transformational change that we're seeing. And John, you talked about kind of the fact directors should ask active questions, they should inform themselves. So let's get into some of the ways in which I think directors can exercise oversight here. And one of the challenges of, I think, the funds model generally is that it's delegated. You have the fund board sitting there and you have delegated providers, management companies, service providers. The investment manager, indeed, in many instances, is a delegated provider, some distance from the board. We have these sort of three components of the value chain: the product component, the distribution component, the investment component. And directors need to kind of get their head around all of that. So this is a challenge anyway for a director to oversee any aspect of that delegating model. But John, turning to you kind of first here, what's unique here, if anything, for a director in trying to get sight over all of those components of the value chain, and I guess make sure they're joined up and overseeing the fact that they are joined up? Okay.
Well, I think it's important, to understand that the role of the fund board is to approve the prospectus, right? Is to approve the pre-contractual documents, right? You may be aware that the machinery that supports that is, within an organization, third party or in-house, but you as a director should be approving fund documentation that means that you would have read it and you understand it, right? So the fact that, the underpinning and the heartbeat of both the Dublin market and the Luxembourg market is a delegated operating model. When you're approving fund documentation, that sits with the board. I think the delegation comes in obviously with the appointment of the management company, who then delegates to the portfolio manager, right? Who then delegates a distribution and whatever else. But when it comes to product approval, new or change, the fund directors collectively should be approving that and not relying on somebody else to say, hey, this is okay. That will be the first point. And like I say, I mean, both marketplaces, in Ireland, you had CP86, in Luxembourg, there was 18698, which was all about, for these delegated models to succeed, governance needs to be strong. Governance needs to relate to individuals on the ground in those domiciles that the regulators can reach out to and talk to. That could be either the designated persons, the dirigeants, or indeed the directors as appointed, right? And that was an uplift in both locations, but that was really about, protecting, I guess collectively between Ireland and Luxembourg, over half, if not 60% of the total European fund AUM is in those two domiciles that don't have a local market, right? So it's all about the exporting of, so your products to other jurisdictions to gather assets in a very efficient model for the asset manager, right? Managing a deep pool of assets with flows coming from many different places. So I think the proper governance on delegation has gone through a journey in terms of the level of documentation, the level of expertise that you have available to you as a management company. And obviously the fund board would be looking at the management company to evidence that. And it's the same if it's an in-house or it's a third party. The expectation is, even if it's an in-house delegation, you treat it as a third party and you have all the documentation available and have the ability to challenge. And I think by and large, both markets have had to make those commitments and upgrades to their substance expertise to provide the comfort to regulators, but more importantly, the comfort to the investors, because more and more this sort of understanding is part of RFP processes, right? Who is the management company? How many people have they got? Yeah. And I guess linked to this topic, I guess the key thing at the moment is management companies now embedding sustainability risk from the 1st of August in all of their policies, procedures, and processes, including oversight of their delegates.
We're going to come to the couple of the points you picked up there, John, in a moment. We had a question on that reliance that you were referring to. Grainne, you mentioned earlier, I think, Top River Partners, who you've established with a couple of other, I think, alumni actually of the CIFD. You're working with directors in this space. So, what's your perspective on how directors can kind of really oversee and engage in these different components of the value chain?
I think John has covered a lot there, and I suppose my challenge to John would be saying that again, I'm coming to this relatively recently, but I would think that particularly around distribution, I think distribution oversight is still the focus on this is relatively new, and I think it's from my perspective, the relative complexities around distribution, both when I was working as a portfolio manager and subsequently in understanding the governance that is needed around distribution, made me, quite surprised to an extent. But also, I think now, with CP86 in Ireland, the onus on the management company to have a designated person for distribution oversight, I think is very, very helpful, because distribution is kind of a nebulous subject to an extent. I mean, it's not like you can rely on quarterly reports to be assured that that's happening, and it probably to an extent does say something also about the overall culture of a company. If the distribution and the product alignment is happening in a seamless way. And my observation and my kind of hunch is that the direction of travel that the industry is going in because of this increased regulatory burden is ultimately very, very positive. But I do think that probably there's, it's like everything. I mean, there are different companies in different stages of that. But from the point of view of thinking about ESG. I mean, personally, and maybe it's just me being very optimistic, but I actually think that the SFDR requirements, I think it offers the investment management industry an opportunity to have more alignment between product and between product and distribution. So ultimately, the end investor does get what they want and what they've asked for, and I think that can only be a good thing. I mean, we're in the early stages of this, and we see the challenges that are there. But I think it behoves the investment manager, the asset manager, the fund management companies to really engage with the regulator as this regulation is being put in place, because ultimately we all want the same end to achieve the same end objective, but the path of going there it can be helped by open dialogue.
Thanks, Grainne. And I guess just to kind of lay this out, really, the challenge that you're presenting there, you have the fund board, the directors on the fund board, they will typically appoint the management company. That management company is going to perform many activities for the fund, and there may be an investment manager kind of as well. So the management company is going to create the product, and as John, as you were saying, the fund directors have some very specific roles there around, for example, approving the prospectus, which is clearly a key document from an authorization perspective for the fund. But also you then have the investment team, which then needs to actually deliver, to actually execute on what you said the product is doing. But you also have the business development team, the distribution team, again, within the management company, which is going out and, concluding relationships with distributors, is trying to sell the product to those distributors. I mean, it feels like there's a lot of sort of components kind of there. So I want to pick up on distribution. I'll ask you a distribution question, John, which is kind of how far does that responsibility of the fund director on the board extend to what that distribution, business development, whatever you want to call it, person is doing, saying to sort of key distributors, because it's the fund name is on that. That's what the investor is going to see. How far does that responsibility extend for the board?
Well, I think there's a responsibility to understand the model, because to Grainne's point, there are various different flavors out there, but generally speaking, the management company would be undertaking the role of marketing and distribution, right, alongside portfolio management and fund administration. Those are the three real pillars that would exist in a traditional management company. You wouldn't expect the fund co to have any more than updates from the sales function itself, because for a lot of these would be regional, right? Dublin and Luxembourg, they're in Asia, LATAM, and EMEA. So there would be probably sales strategy stuff that they would receive. There would be any escalatory event that should be coming from the manco, right? But most houses have gone on a big journey over the last 5 years, primarily pushed by the changes in the AML directives, right? AMLD 4 and 5 have put much greater obligations on, requirements of either reliance or standards. If you're doing business with certainly a Luxembourg fund, I'm assuming it's the same for a Dublin fund. So a whole world of know your intermediary, right? Have a risk assessment on your distribution model. Decide what countries you want to be in. Decide what client types you want to have, right? And that's a policy that should actually be owned by the fund board and executed and reported on by the manco. So it should no longer be a mystery of where does this money come from, right? And your transfer agent record, the register, may bear little resemblance to the commercial model, right? Given the layers of intermediation, whatever, but you would expect that the sales organization, if you're doing business with 20 or 2,000 counterparts that have a distribution agreement executed with you or a delegate, they know who is doing what and when.
Okay, so actually quite, that responsibility is quite extensive. This isn't just, we delegate distribution to the ManCo, they go and, incentivize their salespeople to just get money in, and kind of that's that. What you're describing is a feedback loop, is, real understanding of where flows are coming from by director.
It needs to be proportionate, and it needs to be agreed between the management company and the FundCo, right? I mean, if you're only in 3 countries versus being in 35, it may change the way in which you think about that. But you need to know it. You need to understand.
Yeah. Okay. And I think on the distribution module, certainly on the program, I think we try at least to give directors some tools, or a framework to kind of think about that and be able to ask the right questions, request that the board receives the right management information, kind of etc. To make sure that oversight is being exercised. Grainne, sorry, I cut you off.
I mean, I think just what John has laid out is incredibly clear, but it highlights that level of complexity, and that again, from a point of view of fund governance, I think all executives need to be included in what is required in understanding what their obligations are, and a salesperson can't just make a decision. Actually, I know I can sell this and I can sell it, and it's not quite the way that it should be sold. And I think these kind of things happen, and we know they happen. So I think it really is important that all executives, whether the portfolio manager, the people that are in charge of distribution, are really aware of kind of their responsibilities from a fund governance point of view, because I think that's the only way that can then flow up to the board. Because for the board to have a real handle on that, if it's not happening in a in an organized way at the executive level, I think can be would be very difficult.
Yeah, and to that point, Grainne, it behoves the management company and its executives or the designated persons to be able to really paint that picture, right? Because they're in the day-to-day, right? Absolutely. Boards are supervisory, but they should still understand, okay, so that's really interesting, but on a risk-based approach, where is the most risk and why?
Yeah.
Right? And it may be driven by the type of country that you're in versus another one. It's not to do the work, but I think you can't say I don't know.
So in executing that sort of oversight, there is ultimately reliance, I guess, to some degree on people that are doing the work day to day. So the executive, the staff of the management company. We had a question come in here on what are your views on the quality of chief risk officers, chief compliance officers, others in service providers in the ESG space? And the person who asked this question said, my view is that they're very, very important as the board relies on the reports from these individuals to a significant extent. So, you need help to exercise that oversight, but equally, you're there to oversee. So how does that kind of relationship work from a fund director perspective? I'll just put that to either of you. Who wants to come in?
Well, in responding to that, I'm assuming that the chief risk officer is one of those people that would report to the board, right? And would explain, again, their risk-based approach. Where do they dedicate their time, their team's time? What kind of program are they running? In the same way that with internal audit, all firms have the first, second, third line of defense model, which again should be understood. Kind of, for me, it's relatively straightforward. I mean, everybody's a risk manager, right? And that's the right mindset, even for the board members. They're fiduciary risk managers, but they also need to understand how is the management company organization approaching its risk management, its process. And you should hear from whoever, but it should be normal that risk and compliance and internal audit, would be reporting to the board in some way over whatever agreed frequency, which depends on the scale and the footprint of the particular business model or fund, right? I talk primarily about UCITS, right, and acknowledge that there's a world that isn't dissimilar frankly, between AIFMD and UCITS. So the same principles are there, and the management company is there as well.
Yeah, I would agree with John. I think, from the point of view of a chief risk officer, especially regarding ESG risk, I mean, I think the point is that all these risks need to be should be embedded in an overall risk management framework. In the context of thinking about ESG separately, that shouldn't be the case. And obviously, as we've discussed before, there's many attendant uncertainties around that, but it's really thinking about embedding it as opposed to it being, a standalone risk.
I mean, we introduced, I think, a couple of years ago now, a dedicated risk management module on the CIFD program for exactly that reason, because you can cover this in the individual sort of disciplines, but actually it's important to make sure there is to use the stock phrase, an enterprise-wide sort of risk framework here that you can place reliance on when you are executing that oversight, and use as a tool to really determine where are the areas, the priority areas for you as a director that's not meant to be carrying out operational tasks, but is meant to be overseeing.
And I think maybe for some of the people joining this, there's a great report that was published by Alfie actually in June this year, which was partnered with Morningstar, which was the European Sustainable Investment Fund Study 2022. I think for all fund directors, that should be a go-to document, because that really gives you, insight to what is happening. And actually it's framed from niche to mainstream, which I think gets to Grainne's point, right? Which is the future is this new model, right? And everything is now embedded in common processes, obviously with a new lens applied to it, because again, when we think about distribution, which distribution is the lifeblood of the funds industry. Right? You have the best investment product and no distribution, guess what? You've got no AUM, right? So, if all the flows, which I believe they are heading this way, then the winners are those that do this best.
Okay. We had another question coming from the audience, which Grainne, I'm going to put to you, and please, those of you watching this, please feel free to submit questions. So the question is, and it's an investment question, which is why I've asked you to comment on it. How should directors be differentiating the active engagement with ESG as an investment approach versus the long-term financial risk exposure to sustainability risks? What's your perspective on that from a director's angle?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question in the sense of from an investment. So say again, Giles, from the investment strategy of the investment manager.
Yeah, so I think the question is, so if you're a director, you have, let's say, an active engagement approach with ESG. So yeah. The investment manager is saying, look, I'm engaged with all of these companies that I'm investing in. I'm all over this, because I have to be under the regulations, let's say. Versus, actually a different way of looking at this would be to say, look, actually there is a long-term financial risk exposure here with sustainability. In other words, if you're investing in companies whose business model is going to disappear in however many decades or years or whatever it may be, kind of. So how do you kind of how do you reconcile that as a director, what you might call a sort of stewardship, or I don't know what the correct phrase is for active engagement, but versus that isn't sustainability risk just in it one of the many factors in the investment process?
I think right now, I think a lot of these ESG funds are invested in, they're either invested and they've got, great shareholder engagement, or they're divested. And I think the path of, becoming more sustainable, obviously, one of the issues around the whole ESG legislation is around the sequencing of it. And so actually the CSRD probably needs to be in place before did need to be in place before the SFDR, but unfortunately we don't have that. So I think that, as we travel along this path of sustainability, I think the questions, that a lot of these articulated funds right now are articulated funds, and that's fine. But I think that we will see that understanding what the what the financial exposure, financial risks of some of these underlying companies are, will only come to pass in many years' time. I mean, we know now climate risk is becoming an important part of banks, the way banks think about risk and lending. I mean, we've only kind of started, I suppose, scratching the surface of this. So I think we can engage, boards can engage in it and engage with the investment manager, but where the investment manager is now and where he'll be in, or she will be in 10, 15 years time, given the knowledge that they'll have, will be very different. And I think, I genuinely believe right now we cannot quantify what, particularly around climate risk, what those kind of exposures are. And now, analysts are only starting to incorporate that into part of their investment thesis, which ends up, goes into an investment portfolio construction. So I think that we just keep engaging in it. And if, probably if there is anything that you can add and, point to reports and research that can be helpful, I think that can only be helpful.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it's a challenge, isn't it, given the transitional kind of nature of this. We don't have all of the answers from a regulatory perspective. We don't have all of the, tools and analytics and data. And, so I think it is kind of very much evolving, as you say. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to ask both of you one other ESG question, and we'll see whether we've got any other audience questions after that. And you can't surely attend a ESG or sustainable finance session in Europe without reference to the SFDR, and it's already come up now. So the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which I'm sure everybody knows, has sort of 3 categories, classifications. I don't know what the correct phrase is, but so the Article 6, 8, and 9 kind of disclosure requirements, standards, should we call them? And we've seen in the media, fund houses sort of adjusting their classification. So I'm going to start with you, John, on this. If a fund house is adjusting the classification of a fund or funds, how should boards be thinking about that? What justification do they need to provide? And actually, if they need to do that, does it suggest that they adopted the wrong approach in the first place, or is it a good thing that they're reclassifying their funds?
Well, I guess if the default is your Article 6, which has no stated sustainability, right? It's really on the 8s and the 9s, right? And certainly my observations, be it limited from a whole of market, but I think it's true of a number of houses, is there's been a shift into, the categorization or labeling or whatever you call it into 8 and 9. And I think statistically, again, if you go back to that Alfie report, you'll see some of the numbers in there. It's been quite significant. And alongside that, so that would be like an existing fund transitions to something new, right? So as board member, you're understanding what is it? What is that change? How is it managed? What does it mean from a disclosure perspective, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I think the regulators equally have been passing scrutiny on that kind of fund journey, right, in terms of the article it lands on. I haven't personally experienced any reversal of, oops, we want to go back to something else. I could understand it potentially in the product development cycle, where you have a new fund and thinking about the fund and you want to launch it, that you may then have an aspiration that maybe at a point in time becomes different. But to actually have something that's out there being marketed at one to then become something else, I don't know what the implications would be, but certainly as a board member, that's a red flag, and you really want to understand. Again, it's a supervisory role. So why is that? Can you please explain it? What's the impact of that, right, on investors?
And this is where the distribution team said, look, this has to be an Article 8, fund in order to sell. And then later on in the process, the investment team said, look, actually, that's not what we're delivering.
Which is fine if it's in the process, right? Because investors and distribution should be, and my experience are, integral to the product development lifecycle, right? distribution may want one thing, but it can't be delivered, then it ain't going to happen, right? So if your product governance is working properly, yes, stuff can come out in the engagement, but it shouldn't be coming out in a post-launch, post-filing with a regulator, right? That for me is all the actors in the chain have failed, including potentially the fund board.
Grainne, your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with John. I think I would have a red flag if we're going from Article 8 to Article 6, unless I'm trying to imagine a scenario where it can happen, and probably can happen, and we can be comfortable with it. But I certainly would have a red flag. Going the other way, I mean, I can understand potentially going Article 6, Article 8. Article 6, Article 9 would clearly be, for me, that, I mean, again, a bit of a red flag, or really understanding. I mean, there must be a change in an underlying strategy or an underlying thought process. So, and because we've already identified that this, this is the commercial opportunity. I mean, as businesses, that's where you have to move. And I think the the kind of initial branding of an Article 8 fund is, I mean, it's not hugely onerous. And I think over time we'll have degrees of what type of Article 8 fund that's going to be. And as we progress along this journey, that I think is inevitably going to happen. So I think Article 6 to Article 8, once we have as a board, obviously, we'll have committees to understand it and approve it. But that's something relatively comfortable with. Going the opposite direction, it would be a red flag.
Yeah. And I guess aligned to that, Grainne and Giles, is the fact that under the MiFID sustainable preferences, right, which is the data that now needs to be collected by those firms on their clients. There's I guess an assumption out there where that means that going forward, it's only 8 and 9 that are going to actually be on the selling list, right, or the distribution list for people that are gathering that data.
So we are at time. I feel another webinar coming on sustainability preferences in the future, John. You just raised that, but I just want to say thank you to both of you, John and Grainne, for your excellent insights. I love talking about this topic. I love talking about fund governance as well, but fund governance and ESG is even more interesting. So thank you very much for your insights. And I'm going to turn back over to you, Kate, just to close the session off.
Great. Listen, thank you, Giles. Thank you, John and Grainne, for today's webinar. As Giles said, I feel a series of ESG webinars coming on. I think we'll be doing one a week for the rest of the year. So just prepare yourself, Giles. Giles in particular, thank you so much for managing the discussion today and all your planning in advance. And Grainne and John, thank you for joining us from your different parts of the world. Really appreciate having such an international flair at today's webinar. And also, as somebody working in education, it's always great to hear so much discussion about keeping people informed and keeping up to date, and love that our directors have that outlook, knowing that they need to keep up to date with their information and knowledge so they can keep asking those right questions in the boardroom. Today's webinar is going to be recorded. It'll be available to members on IOB Learn, and I will share it with the non-members who are attending today. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues. And if you have, again, any questions on the CIFD programme, please don't hesitate to get in contact with myself or Giles, and we'd be happy to talk to you on the programme. I'd like to end today's webinar there. And again, thank you all so much for joining us today. Hope you have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ciao, ciao.